Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by Una, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barner. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is Alison Smith. You may know her as the purchasing coach or the founder of Landscaping Your Life, but if you are connected to her on LinkedIn, you know that she has boundless energy and passion for absolutely everything she does. Alison has worked in and with procurement for almost 4 decades, using her unique approach to help teams achieve lots of success without having to choose to check their humanity at the door. So, Alison, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Can you share, now I mentioned you've been in procurement, but you've also done a lot of other things. Can you share just a little bit more detail around your background and professional experience for anyone that hasn't already met you?
Yeah, I started in the mid-'80s as an expediter in the days when there weren't computers to chase up and find out where goods were, and started within materials buying, really, printed circuit boards, integrated circuits, but very quickly got into indirect spend, and ended up as a procurement manager for indirect spend, and then moved into sort of procurement director for a university, and then sort of moved into category management, and then ended up, and I suppose this is where the journey starts to bring in other things than procurement, because having gone and done neuro-linguistic programming training and started to expand my interest into all things soft skills and mindset, ended up being a communication and personal development manager within a procurement organisation, in a finance organisation.
Well, and it's interesting because you and I were joking about this in the green room before we started. You have this one picture that you share periodically on social media where you actually dug a hole in the sand and you stuck your head into the hole to take the picture to visually make the point about how we often limit our perspective, our thinking. And if that's not proof that you are one of the funniest, most creative people out there, I don't know what could prove that. So I have to ask, how on earth did you end up stuck in boring, stiff old procurement, given your creativity and energy?
The answer is the university careers advisor said your analytical skills and your people skills would work really well in procurement. So there is a part of me that I don't know comes out often in social media, but does when I'm working with clients, is the analytical mind. So my thesis was statistical analysis. So there's a definite part of me that likes Excel spreadsheets. So procurement brought that together. And I think as a result of the journey I've been on, I just found that, or allowed that quirky looking at things differently to be with me for the whole of the journey. And therefore, you're right, I then end up being seen as somebody that helps procurement look differently, because that's how I've been in my career that I mentioned earlier.
Now, unlike most of the conversations that I have here on the Sourcing Hero, this conversation we're having today actually started with an idea. So typically I would connect with a person and then we would sort of figure out the conversation, the story, the point of view that we're going to share. But you attended Art of Procurement's Mastermind live virtual event back in October. And one of the sessions led you to share this hand-drawn infographic that you put together about all the different ways that people can bridge the gap. Right. And so we've talked about procurement needing to look at things differently, hopefully, creatively, to get across either some of the gaps or some of the changes that we naturally find ourselves approaching. I personally found it really compelling. So we actually started this conversation with, I would love to have you come in and talk more about that idea. So to get us started, what is the kind of gap that you had in mind when you put together that image?
The gap is just the gap between where you are and where you want to be, whether that's in your life, whether it's with respect to a stakeholder, whether it's with respect to a particular objective that you've got. So it could even be, the savings targets. Like, this is where I am, and this is where I want to be, and therefore the gap is the space between one and the other.
And I know there are a million different ways to bridge the gap, not all of which apply directly to procurement. But when you think about all of the different creative ways, what are a few that pop into your mind about the options that we might have available to us?
Well, I think that's where I would say that the first thing to do is to stick with the metaphor. So rather than jump straight into logically coming up with what the different ways of bridging the gap are, because if we allow logic, it will come up with what we know, and that metaphor sometimes enables us the sort of invisible to become visible, is to stick with it metaphorically. So the way that the picture that you mentioned earlier was two sides of a canyon, really, and the gap was, from one side of the canyon to the other. And therefore, if you look at metaphorically, the sorts of things that would enable you to get from one to the other might be to build a bridge. It might be to get a map so that you understand how to get from one side to the other. It might be to jump over because the gap may not be so great. If the canyon's not so tall, it might be the fact that you can do stepping stones. What the metaphor then enables you to do is to come up with solutions about what would a map look like in this situation, or what would building a bridge look like. And what it enables you to do is to think about, well, is it the fact that somebody else is going to give me a map, or is it the fact that I need to build a bridge, or is it the fact that I'm going to ask for help to fly over the canyon? So I think there's lots of different ways of bridging it. We just have to be careful that we don't prejudge and go, oh, well, it's always going to be a map, I've got to come up with a plan. Whereas actually it might just be, well, there's a bridge over there, let's just go and walk over the bridge. We're trying to do it on our own. Somebody else has already bridged the gap. We just need to learn from them and do what they've done.
Now, one of the things, and when we go from the metaphor into how it applies in life and work, when in the metaphor, your little stick figure comes to the gap, comes to the edge of the canyon, you can see I can't safely take another step forward. I'm going to have to figure out a way to get over there. And there's something physically that you can see at some distance where you're trying to get to. Now, in real life, sometimes that where I'm trying to get to is not so clear. And whether it's procurement trying to come up with their own unique vision for where they're going, or even something as straightforward, I think of this from a content creation standpoint. I will know that on the other side of my canyon is the best article or the best white paper for this particular project that I'm working on. But until I get the idea, or in procurement's case, until I've really crystallized my vision for, what's on the other side of this gap, picking the right way to bridge it is hard. For the people that you've coached and worked with, do you find that it's harder for them to really wrap their mind around what it is that's on the other side of that canyon? Or is it harder to, once that future goal is visualized, figure out the right way to get there?
I think it is what's the goal, really. It's what's the other side of the canyon that's the hard thing, because otherwise quite often we can think we're clear and come up with all this lovely plan about how we're going to get there, and then we get there and realize, oh, this isn't where I wanted to be, this isn't what I thought it was. So there's definitely something about spending as much time being very clear about the goal, and in some respects even more clearer about what that achieving that goal will give you. Because quite often that's the bit that people miss out. It's like, what's important about this goal? Because sometimes we think achieving something will give us something else, and it won't. And the other thing is that actually if we can be clear about what achieving that goal will give us, it will also help us tap into our values and therefore provide more motivation. And therefore that motivation will help us find all of the different ways to get, to bridge that gap.
Now, to your point about motivation, so again, we're with your stick figure on the first side of the canyon. Now, if the stick figure is Indiana Jones, he's got some massive stone ball rolling at him, right? And he's got to choose really fast. But for most of us, there's not necessarily immediate time pressure. And so I have to think that it could potentially become an issue where our mind starts to play little tricks on us, saying like, well, but maybe think about this a little bit longer. Maybe another option for how to bridge the gap will come to mind. Or maybe you need to think a little bit more about exactly what's on the other side of the canyon. Is there a natural hesitation to choosing one route? And how long should we keep rethinking it? How long should we kind of let that play out in our minds before we get to the point of diminishing returns where picking any way to get past the canyon is actually better than continuing to sit back and think about it?
Oh, so many great questions. You're right. One of the poems that I use in the work talks about not making a decision until you get to the first crossroads. And I think quite often we sort of don't take any action until we're clear about what we're going and where we're headed. And actually, in that particular instance, we're saying movement towards a crossroads is better than staying where you are. So there is something about, the excuses we give ourselves for not taking action. And I think that comes back to, lack of self-belief, sort of lack of awareness. So I don't know that there's a time limit as much as being a bit more aware about, actually I've been at this far too long and these are now excuses. So it's sort of shining a light on, is this a real reason about me not taking action, or is it the fact that I'm scared to take action? As a coach, that's what I'd be asking somebody. I'd be tracking for, now I've heard this, this is just an excuse. It's not an accurate reflection of the situation.
Does it get easier over time? I mean, we all, again, whether it's in life or work, are constantly coming to crossroads. Sometimes we realize it, and sometimes we don't realize we're at a crossroads and we're making a choice. I often think about that. I've mentioned this in a couple of the other conversations. My original plan, Alison, was to be a professor of Shakespeare. That clearly didn't work out. But I still think about those things. And one of the things I remember is that, there's tragedies, of course, and there's comedies, and the characters don't know which one they're in. But if I knew I was in Othello or Hamlet versus knowing I was in Midsummer Night's Dream or Twelfth Night, I would make different choices because I would recognize, I'm a well-known character in a tragedy. Maybe I should make some safer choices.
Oh, cool.
We don't always realize the long-term implications where it's a major crossroads in our life. And we just think, I'm just deciding where to go grab lunch today. Does purposefully approaching crossroads get easier with time? Or is it something that every single crossroads we recognize is so different that you're really kind of starting the process of self-examination and decision-making all over again each time?
The answer to that, I think, is both, in as much that there are patterns. So my need to be in control will be a pattern that comes out all the time, and therefore I can look at that and try and address that. And yet there are other times where, each situation is unique, and therefore, and in some respects, that's absolutely why I'm still here. Why I don't get bored, because if it was the same answer for everybody, I mean, even looking at category strategies, the fact that, one consultancy category strategy for one organization is going to be so different from another because all the patterns are different, how they engage with the market's different, their relationship with the market's different. I think that's the same in coaching, that there are patterns, there are things that we know about ourselves that may make things easier or more difficult. But at the end of the day, this particular where I am and this particular where I want to get to and this particular gap today in this moment is very unique. And therefore I can't, and certainly if we look at what's just happened for the last, I keep saying 18 months, it's now nearly 2 years. But
Yeah.
if we look at what's happened there, then what worked 2 years ago may not work now. And therefore, we've got to be really careful that we don't just sort of personally and from organisationally just wheel out strategies because they worked for us at some point in the past.
Well, and here's the other thing that I would think about that. And again, I'm seeing your little stick figure person in my mind's eye, and I'm thinking about that picture. And when I looked at it, of course, there's just the one little stick figure in the picture, and you can psychoanalyze this later, but I looked at the picture and thought, okay, I'm the little person. So I'm putting myself into the scenario. I'm the little person. I had not necessarily thought of myself as potentially being someone giving the little stick figure advice, or maybe there's 12 other little stick figures just off the edge of your paper that you've drawn. Maybe this person does work with the coach like you work with people, and there's another little stick figure somewhere nearby, like, maybe shouting from the other side of the canyon. How does the team dynamic or the role of community, whether it's a large group or whether it's yourself and a close colleague or a couple of close colleagues, how does that kind of idea play into how we make decisions when we come to these crossroads?
Oh, blimey. It's a hard one. I don't know that I've got an answer to that one, Kelly. Tell me that one again. I was just a bit distracted by the doorbell. So that was one of those things where the doorbell went. And so I was sort of half listening. So tell me the whole question again, and let's see if I can...
Sure. So I'm actually thinking about this crossroads type of decision in the context, as you mentioned, of the, let's say 2 years, right? I think many of the decisions we had to make during that time were more difficult and felt weightier because we were making them alone. Because even if we were part of a team at work, it was a virtual team, which is not the same as everybody being in the office together. If it's life decisions, we might be making these choices far more isolated from friends and family and neighbors and things that we might have been in the past. And I'm wondering about the role of making crossroads related decisions as a team, making them with input from other people, making them with the assistance of a coach, and how that changes both how we see the canyon and also how we ultimately make the decision, what is the best way to bridge it?
Oh, cool. Lots of different answers to that one. Where initially my head went, and this isn't what I'd be saying in an organisational setting, but actually quite often the reason that we don't know what to do is because we listen to other people and we don't listen to our own inner wisdom. So actually, hopefully, some of this isolated working will have done us a lot of good in terms of us learning that self-belief, learning how to hear that inner wisdom say, turn left today. So there is that element of it. And actually asking for other people's help, again, requires that self-awareness of understanding there is a gap and currently I'm not bridging it. So I'm stuck. So it's a lot of the work I do is with people who have had a problem for a while. But the hardest thing is people understanding that they're stuck, because quite often they can think they're making progress without realizing that either the progress is in the opposite direction than what they want to go, or that it's just going round in circles, or it's in that rut, or they're lost in that, the wood they can't see for the trees. And so I think that's where the helping other people, asking for help either from a coach or from colleagues comes in. But it does require that awareness, because either you're then, head down, not realizing that actually there's help out there that would enable you to get help you understand where you want to get to and help you then bridge the gap from where you are to get there.
I love your point about listening to the inner voice. It probably comes as no surprise that I think I've now personally had, close to 25 of these conversations. And anytime we get around to soft skills, listening is one that always comes up. And people talk about active listening, or they talk about, watching people's body language in addition to listening to the sound of their voice, or listening to tone in addition to listening to words, or trying to hear in an email something that is not necessarily directly expressed. But I don't think anybody has brought up both the importance and the difficulty of listening to, would you say our instincts? You called it inner voice, but is instinct another way to look at that?
Instinct, intuition, inner wisdom. I try not to label it, because otherwise people might react to, especially if you then go down a sort of more spiritual direction and say soul.
True.
So I try not to. It's just that, that inner part of you that does know what to do, that when you sort of pull away the musts, oughts and shoulds, does have access to more information than we think. And I think what I've done is gone out of my way to find coaching tools that help us listen to that. So I would always say that because they feel uncomfortable because they don't necessarily involve logic too much. We're sort of sending logic on a holiday or a coffee break, and in order to be able to hear that inner wisdom, because logic and inner wisdom don't necessarily always happen at the same time. So if we want to listen to our inner wisdom, the dial of logic needs to be turned down. And so I use the metaphor of sending it on a coffee break or a holiday, because that seems to work. And logic actually will play along with you. I did a coaching session recently where logic kept trying to take over the conversation, and I
come back early from coffee.
Well, yes. And so I actually ended up having to give it a time. I sort of said, right, logic of this client, you can come back at 10:04. And at this point, we were sort of 40 minutes away from there. But logic then calmed down. So sometimes we do have to be a bit specific about, this is the time when logic will be able to look at all of these creative and lovely ideas, our inner wisdom, or creative mind has come up with. But let's not bring logic back too quickly.
So, Alison, as we come to the end of our time, now you thought this was tricky so far, but I always warn people, this is the very hardest question that I ask anyone that comes on this podcast, with all the complicated things that we get into. This is the sourcing hero. And so I always like to have an opportunity to ask people, either what is your idea of a sourcing hero, or if you prefer to refer to it a little bit more broadly, what does heroism mean to you in a business context?
I don't know whether I don't find this difficult, because this seems to be my vision about why I do what I do, in terms of the fact that for me, the hero is the one that is vulnerable, that is real, that turns up with all of themselves. So it goes back to that intuition, mind, body, heart and soul, and is prepared to say, I don't know the answer to that, or I'm sorry I got that wrong. And to be there in all of their humanness, rather than this stereotype of who they think they should, ought and must do, that others then struggle to relate to, because it feels as if, well, we're then playing that archetypal game of, well, you're in this, going back to your the comedy piece, the fact that there's archetypes within those plays, and people, if we're not careful, end up going into each archetype. And so procurement can be there, or sourcing can be there as one archetype, and it automatically will set up the defending archetype from suppliers or stakeholders. And what I would see as a hero is one that sort of doesn't buy into that archetype, because then it enables and brings out the best in the person we're speaking to, rather than them automatically reacting via another stereotype because we've, So it's the bit bad cop piece, the fact that if we're the bad cop, it automatically brings out a reaction in others. And I just want us to be, human.
And if only that were easy, right?
Well, but you see, but this is the.
Why is this so hard?
Yeah, I suppose this is where people go, it's easy for you, Alison. You don't work in an organisation. You're just a consultant. But even when I worked for an organisation, because I've worked, for half of my career, I worked in organisations, and the last half of it, I've worked as a consultant and coach and trainer. But I still think that I was me then and I am now. And I always get told, oh, it's easy for you. I don't know why it's easy for me, because I don't think it's any easier for me than anybody else. I just am prepared to put up with the consequences if I do that. I think that's the thing. It's like I don't buy into a belief that if I express an opinion and I shouldn't do because I'm, in a particular position, that's going to mean I lose my job. It's like, well, actually, I'm prepared to lose the job if that's the case, because I don't want to be in an environment where we have to play games. It's like, what to me, the harder action, if that's the right word, or activity, is the game playing. And I'm not sure I've got the ability to play games. So for me, the easiest route is for me to be me, rather than play the game. So perhaps I've just gone for the lazy route, actually, for me. It's like, actually, I don't want to go and have to learn the archetype of this, this archetype or that archetype. But if I just turn up as me, that's damn sight easier.
Well, I'm certainly glad that you turned up as you today. I will say I loved this conversation. We brought some really different ideas into the conversation, I think. And for anybody that has listened in and wants to learn more about you, your work, some of the different coaching and resources and things that you mentioned, where would you suggest people go, either to connect with you or to learn more?
On LinkedIn, but of course there may be a few Alison Smiths. So it is Alison Smith EU. So if you did Alison Smith, Alison with one L and an I, so ALISON, Smith, EU at the end, that will find me. But the easiest way, actually, is if you put in the hashtag landscaping your life, whether you put that in Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter even, that's where and YouTube, then you'll find me through that, the hashtag. So there's that landscaping your life, because that just shares all of the tools that I use to help people think differently. But there's also a book that I've written called Can't See the Wood for the Trees, that is really helpful for coaches, trainers and facilitators to have tools to help people think differently. But also the second half of the book is all about helping you bridge that gap, whether or not, but specifically around if you're going around in circles, you can't see the wood for the trees, you're stuck in a rut, feel like a fish out of water. So there's chapters there that help you metaphorically find solutions. So it is helping you tap into that inner wisdom that we talked about, to help you bridge the gap from where you are to where you'd like to be.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well, and always remember that you can be a hero too.